Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Advanced Leadership Development Using Simulations. My name is Selena, and I'll be getting us started before we pass it over to our presenter, Sam Turner. To begin, let's go over a few logistics. To keep background noise to a minimum, you're all on mute. We've added the presentation deck in the handout section of the webinar, which you are welcome to download now if you haven't already. We want your questions, so there is a question pane in the webinar panel where you can enter them at any time throughout the presentation. With time left over at the end of the webinar, Sam will answer as many questions as he can. Lastly, we are recording this webinar and it will be available on the MHS Talent YouTube channel in about 1 week. The link to that YouTube channel is displayed here, so be sure to subscribe. For those of you new on the line, a little bit about MHS. Combining the power of people analytics with proven training and development best practices, we help organizations attract, retain, and develop top talent. Located in Toronto, Canada, MHS has been serving clients across the world for over 35 years. In the talent space, we are most widely known for our work in emotional intelligence and specifically the tool EQI 2.0. We offer custom assessment solutions, and our diverse toolkit includes assessments and simulations on personality, leadership, hardiness, entrepreneurship, change management, influence, decision-making, and much more. I'll pass it off to Sam now, who will share a little bit about himself.
Thanks, Selena. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from today. My name is Sam Turner, and I'm thrilled to be with you to talk about leadership development and specifically using simulations. And so before we get talking about simulations, let me share a little bit about my background and specifically what my orientation or what my approach might be to leadership development. So I've spent a decade of my career in industry and a decade in consulting, and then also a decade almost, it seems like, in graduate school. And today I provide leadership consulting and coaching and leader development. So I'm a social psychologist by training, and for those of you without a psychology background, this might seem like a little bit of hair splitting, but for my colleagues that come from either a clinical or counseling or a personality background, oftentimes the orientation is about identifying the leader as they approach the context in which they work in. And for social psychologists, that's important, and also our orientation is somewhat flipped from that. We're much more likely to identify the context that we're embedded in and consider how the environment may be interacting with the leader themselves and how that advances the way we think, we feel, and we behave. So with that in mind, I'm a huge advocate for experiential learning. I hope you are as well, or I hope you'll at least give strong consideration to it as a result of us talking about simulations today. And simulations are fun and exciting and a great way to advance leadership development. So here's our agenda for today. There's 3 primary things that we're aiming to do, and the first of those is really just to get a better sense of why you should make learning experientially and trying simulations part of your development practice. Secondly, we're going to look a little bit at how different simulations, how you're able to connect assessments with them, how you're the best way to embed it in training and development, and to have a better sense of how they look and feel, kick the tires, so to speak. And then we're going to talk about kind of one of the primary elements that's the most important, and that is leaving your participants with a really strong and powerful debriefing session. And we'll probably wrap up with some best practices as well. And hopefully we'll have time for some good questions at the end. All right. So before we talk about simulations, I think it does make sense to spend just a moment or two talking about learning, because what we are ultimately endeavoring to do is to intersect the art and science of leadership. And the way that we do that is helping our clients and our participants acquire new skills, knowledge, and abilities, those KSAs that industrial psychologists like to talk about. And I love the metaphor of the road, because it's the path or the road that we're taking along with them to help them have that growth, to create that awareness, that reflection, and to end up being better at what they do at work. So there's kind of two schools of thought about development work. And if you will please indulge me for just a minute, this might be a little bit of a leap of faith of these two quotes, but I think they kind of capture a little bit for me what those distinctions are. And on the left side, you see this quote, right, that captures one school of thought. And this is a quote from the author Mark Twain. There's more treasure in books than in all the pirates' loot on Treasure Island. And for me, what that suggests is the idea that the knowledge is power, that the more that we know about ourselves, the more we know about others, the more that we know about the work that we do, theoretically, the better we are at doing that, the more effective we become. And so from a leadership development context, that makes all good sense until you run into the snag, right? And this snag you've probably experienced at some point. So as an example, I had an attorney client whose entire practice had gone through a leadership development experience. So I want you to just imagine this for a second. They shut the practice down. They ask all these 100 or 200 attorneys to respond to these leadership assessments, and they're going to carve time out of their calendars to bring them all together and to do a debriefing and training on these assessments. Now, mind you, these are two internationally known assessments that I commonly use in my practice and that are well-validated instruments. And when I learned that this client had just gone through this experience, I said, oh, that's great, because I'd love to be able to use that data, and I would have probably asked you to take these assessments anyway as part of your pre-work. And so I then asked, so what was that experience like? And to my disappointment, right, this client said to me, I didn't quite get it, and I'm not really sure why we did it. And so this is what the big issue is with just the idea that knowledge is power, because we have to help our clients understand what that knowledge means to them. So this other quote by Albert Einstein, I think captures a different perspective, and that is that the only thing that interferes with my learning is my education. And so as you think about that client that I just referenced, the knowledge itself of those assessments was really important to get the language around his preferences, to understand better around how he interacts with the working world. But then the important piece is to say, so what do I do about that? And how do I know that looks? And what is that, how is that helping me? Or how is that preventing me from being successful? And so I hope you'll bear with me as we explore the idea of simulations and then maybe revisit the thought about how this experience can kind of encourage people to have a better understanding. So we're fortunate to have a lot of people who have contributed to the literature over the years in one form or another. Now, mind you, none of these people were doing research or being theorists for the place of creating workplace simulations, and yet their work inherently does impact what we know about how people learn today. So John Dewey, the famous educational psychologist, said, if knowledge comes from the impressions made upon us by natural objects, it is impossible to procure knowledge without the use of objects which impress the mind. And so this notion of problem-based learning is that we are going to learn the most through touching things, through inquiry, through hands-on learning. Jean Piaget, who is a Swiss developmental psychologist, developed these idea of schemas, right? And they're mental representations. And we all have these mental representations, and they help us understand and navigate the world. But when you look at leaders, sometimes their mental representations about how to lead are really spot on, and sometimes they're not. And so it's helpful to really begin to challenge these mental representations and help people maybe see it from a different perspective. Kurt Levine was a psychologist that immigrated to the US right after the World War, and he was a German psychologist. And his contribution, I think, is summarized in this formula here. And that is that behavior is a function of both the person and the environment, right? And so we can look at an individual and we can consider how they are as a leader, but we also have to look at the environment that they're embedded in and look at how they interact with each other. Now, the last of these, I think, is the most pertinent to the work we're going to be talking about today, and that's the idea of experiential learning and what that model looks like. And I'm going to show you in just a minute what that model does. So hang tight on David Kolb's work. So all of these people weren't necessarily attempting to help leadership development per se, but I think leadership development today is better off because these theorists did work around how people learn and how to advance knowledge. And that is exactly what we're endeavoring to do today. So I mentioned the experiential learning model. And so we're putting through our clients through some type of experience. And it can, it's involving all the senses. There's the visual, there's the auditory, there's the kinesthetic. There may be other senses that are involved as well. But as we put through those experiences, we're encouraging them to take time for reflection, to understand what that looked and felt like, maybe how they interacted in that particular experience. And then we want to take that knowledge and generalize it, apply it to their practice to be better at what they do. And it's a very circular experience, right? It's the continuous loop of learning. And thankfully, we all have a job today because our clients are on that continuous path of learning. Now, one of the advantages about doing leadership simulations is captured by this metaphor of a cliff, right? As you think about standing on top of that cliff, right, looking out at the learning horizon, it takes such a long time to acquire the knowledge that we need in order to be effective at the jobs that we do. So what normally might take weeks or months or even years, we're condensing that experience down into a matter of a couple of hours or a couple of days. And we're quickly confronting issues and problems and challenges and encouraging people to learn from that. So just think of maybe that movement off that safe space, right? Moving towards a different object or a different place and a different learning. So let me be clear that I trust my assessments and I use them frequently, and they're very instructive to understand what clients' preferences are and where they come from. And so what traditional training and assessments do is add to our clients what we call declarative knowledge. And that knowledge is the facts about what they do, the skills, the abilities, all the knowledge that we need to do the work that we do and to understand how we are. And so by providing this development experience, you're adding the person analysis. So people are getting much better rooted in kind of the terminology of their activities and their behaviors, and they're learning about themselves and they're learning about others. So what happens when you add simulations to those development experiences and integrate them with both the training assessments and the stand-up training from facilitators such as ourselves? Well, you're adding real play. So you're essentially asking them to take on real contextual issues that they might face at work. And these simulations are intended to have some level of psychological fidelity. And psychological fidelity is really the idea of replicating the essential characteristics of the real world to help produce learning transfer. And so if you're listening to this and you're feeling a little bit skeptical about that, and believe me, sometimes participants do as well, the question might come like, hey, I don't make paper airplanes for a living. Tell me a little bit about how the learning transfer is going to happen from this and how this relates to the work that I do. Well, we can help them understand that fidelity by exposing them to that experience, because oftentimes it takes very little time for people to understand that they work with other people, that they have resource constraints, just like they might in a simulation, that they have both internal and external stakeholders, that there's client needs, that there's going to be quality issues or time issues. And so these are the things that are the realistic part of work. And the goal about doing any of this is to help increase the self-efficacy. And that is our ability or our willingness to grant ourselves confidence in the work that we do. The interesting thing about simulations as well is because you're going through this experience with other people, there's learning within a group. You're not just going through the experience yourself, right? You're observing what other people are doing. You might observe what people do that you don't like and things that you do like, things that you'd want to replicate or emulate, and things that don't work and that you recognize. And that all leads to what we call vicarious learning. Right? We're learning through observations. And even when other people have these aha moments, we are lucky enough to be there to learn them as well. So this is a little bit about what the additional use of simulations can add to the learning experience. So I'm going to warn you, I'm going to actually demonstrate some of this work using actual client pictures. And these are pictures often shot with my iPhone. So what they lack in technical, in terms of how professional they look, these are people who are really interacting. And so this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but what you see is the before, where people are coming together. In this particular client, this is a multinational, multilingual, cross-functional group of clients that are working together virtually, but they get an opportunity to come together. And what we're hoping to do with simulated learning is to really encourage them to have a better relationship, get to know each other, and learn how to work together better. And so you've got the before picture and the after picture. And it's really quite unique to observe that. So a couple of things about what simulations do. Obviously, they're there to bridge the gap between what we know about the work we do and what we actually do. So sometimes there's a discrepancy, as we all know, between what people's self-knowledge is and what their reputations are at work. We want to be able to experience our preferences and styles in a safe and non-judgmental environment. So as trained facilitators, we're there to create the safe space to have these conversations with our clients. And we want them to learn the consequences of their decisions in real time through reflection and experimentation, right? So that reflection comes through actually creating the time and space for people to think about how that felt, how that went, what they could have done better, what they want to do, what they want to try next time. And we can also encourage people to step outside of their comfort zones with relatively low risk to their careers in the organization. So their work during the experience is not going to necessarily impact the P&L, and it could encourage them to take on a level of leadership that they're unaccustomed to doing. So just a very couple off-the-cuff reasons when to use simulations. And I bet you could brainstorm another 20 ways to use them as well. To encourage self-awareness of team leaders, to help a struggling team get better together and get more work done, to improve communication, and to improve the capacity to solve problems, to prepare a department to undergo significant change, to assist a group in redesigning a dated work process. Really, the other side of that is really to innovate and to be better at what you do, to assess and improve leader development. So these simulations can be embedded before a strategy meeting. They can be embedded when there's actually some derailment factors that are happening in a team. They can also be embedded to help people just kind of imagine what work would like different if it was better. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what simulations, why we do them, and where we come from in terms of orientation to do this type of work. Let's talk about some specific simulations, and I want to go deep enough just to give you a taste of what these simulations look and feel like. And then obviously, if you'd like to know more information, please be in touch with us, and we'd be happy to give you all the information that you want. The other thing that I'd like to attempt to do is try to connect it to other ways of learning content that's in traditional leadership development. Right, so before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about best practices. And so some of this might be fairly straightforward, but it's definitely worth mentioning. So one thing that you want to consider when you're experimenting with the idea of using a simulation with a client is really to select the appropriate simulation. And that comes from the exploration that you would normally do with your client anyway, and better understanding about what the learning need is. And so as you design your optimal program, you're going to be taking into consideration all kinds of things like budget and timing and logistics and geographic location and all those things that make complete sense. But then you'll also be thinking about, from a learning perspective, what are we honestly trying to achieve here, and what would be the best solution to embed? Lots of planning goes ahead of time because some of these require some fairly heavy logistics and setup. From a perspective of the facilitator, it's so important for us to be good observers about what's going on, because we're the eyes and ears of development and assessing those gaps and helping debrief those experiences. We want to get to know our clients and the participants to the best of your abilities ahead of time. Who are they? What are they? What are they trying to achieve? What are their business objectives? What are their key performance indicators? What's their strategy look like? And how would this experience connect to that? Coaching the leader is sometimes, particularly when you have multiple levels of leadership inside a simulation, I like to pull my leaders aside, and particularly the more senior folks, and say, would you consider just being a participant today and just interacting with people as opposed to driving decisions? And in fact, you could even take it a step beyond that and ask, who are the people that are in this group that you'd like to encourage them to take on more thought leadership? We might position them to be the leader of the group. Because simulations are realistic and are real world, they invite a full array of human emotions and reactions. And so as a facilitator, knowing when to intervene into a situation that arises during a simulation is a little bit of the art and science of leadership. My tendency is to observe interactions with people unless they're going to come to blows, and just let that play out, because that can sometimes be much deeper in the debriefing afterwards. Obviously, you want to know the simulation, kind of understand the logistics and what the touch points are going to look like with the client. And then last but not least, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, establishing those ground rules that I know you all do anyway, because we have to create the safe space for people to do this work in. And because there is going to be debriefing and sometimes peer interactions around those debriefs, we want to make sure that everybody is in a place that they're going to be able to learn and get value out of it. Okay, so here are the simulations I'm going to touch on. This is a part of the portfolio of simulations at MHS. I've had the pleasure of being able to do all of these simulations. They're lots of fun. They're great client experiences. And I'm going to just walk through them at a very high level and talk a little bit about them. So they're press time, edge work, paper scrapers, and paper planes. And we're going to start with paper planes first. So what I'm going to do is just tell you a little bit about the basics of the simulation, and then I'm going to walk through and share some client experiences and tell you a little bit about the types of things that I'm looking for and what I'm observing about the group and how I use that information. So this is a 6-hour simulation. It has both paper and online component to it. For audiences of 12 to 30 per simulation. So you can run concurrent multiple groups with different facilitators. And let me even encourage you to be thinking, if in the course we start going over these simulations and you feel intimidated by either the certification process or being able to facilitate these, don't let that be a stumbling block, because we want to help you consider how to use these. And so if it's getting certified yourself on these on these simulations, fantastic. If it is talking to the OD Solutions group about bringing some facilitators in to provide this, that works as well. So these are sold in supply kits and also a toolkit to manage the facilitation. And you see the picture of the actual work product, the planes there when they're finished. So this is what the design looks like when it's laid out. And what you'll notice about it is we're actually giving a role assignment to each of the participants. And collectively, that group of people are building in an assembly line fashion a paper airplane. And they're given instructions in their very first run to complete as many as they can to specification that the client will buy them. But as a result of the learning curve and the way that the the facilitation is set up, groups tend to not be overly successful the first time that they run the simulation. But the great thing about this simulation is that once they've they've gone through a full run, then they get together with the facilitators you see in the circle of chairs there, and they're going to debrief that experience. And the facilitator is going to work with them to help them think about how it worked, what could have been done better, what was missing, how communication was, what did leadership look like, and debrief all of the things that we're looking for in the groups. And we'll talk about some of the things that come up in just a minute. And then they're then given the ability to reflect, redesign, and then they do that run again. And then they debrief it, and they redesign it, and they do it again. And you might be thinking, well, gosh, they're bound to make some changes, and that's exactly right. So the only thing that we're requiring them to do is to produce that plane to specification. But the way that they go about doing it is entirely up to the group itself. And that's where the learning happens. That's where people begin to understand it's through collaboration, it's through communication, that work designs and workflows and after action reviews and talking about how the work worked. That is where they can then begin to make the integrations about the real world work that they do and what's missing. So if you work in a culture that's very execution focused and not spending any time on planning and strategy, there's some really great reflection there. Or if you work in an environment where it's very siloed, then these are the types of things that are going to come up with the participants just in the course of their debriefings. So these pictures are not great, but I hope they're going to illustrate a little bit about what tends to happen with these groups. And this is a group of participants in London who are going through paper plane simulation. And what you'll notice in the very far left picture is the participants are seated at their workstations, highly reflective of siloed work. Oftentimes, because it's an assembly line process, those people at the beginning of the assembly line process are working diligently to create product. And those people towards the end are just staring. They're not participating always, right? And this is really kind of in essence what that we're capturing to bring up during the debriefing. Now, as that simulation progresses and they become aware of the gap between what they could perform and what they have been performing, the energy begins to rise in the group. People are standing and they may redesign the workflow, and they're standing much closer to each other. And in this particular group, you'll notice that as they progress in the simulation, they're much tighter. They're working more heavily with each other. There's a lot of co-action that's taking place because the performance expectation is there with the group. They've set the standards. They know that they're underperforming and they want to do better. And then change and innovation is always part of today's work. And so we embed that into the simulation as well. And in this case, the client has made a change in the color planes that they want. And this particular group, the way that they reacted to that is they absolutely just pushed it off the table, didn't bat a lash, doubled down, just kept getting the product going. And not every team responds in a way that's similar to that. And so this is the beauty of something like this, because you begin to understand the people that you're interacting with, what their values are, what they align as success, right? We have teams that sometimes are very oriented to each other, and that are kind of their emphasis is on kind of building relationships and rapport and not so much on the performance. And then we have some teams like this one that are very performance oriented and they want to push through as much product as possible. So, and this is where really the value of learning comes from. This is an example of a client redesign. And in this case, they're reflecting on ways that they can be better. And you'll notice that the leader that's sitting down with the finger and with a pencil in their hand pointed is commanding the show. But sometimes those redesigns are frenetic, and there's 10 conversations going on at once. And some people are working on redesigning the workflow, and some people are experimenting with how much time it takes to get every station to get the product through them. So this is, again, from a facilitator perspective, very rich to be able to understand kind of what the group appreciates, how they approach problem solving, and how much they're pushing the envelope. Or this is this in terms of their innovation. Are they just making incremental changes? Are they making really fundamental changes to the workflow? The next simulation that I want to talk about is edge work. And the edge work is a really thoughtful, strategic exercise. Whereas paper planes is very hands-on and tactile, this is a simulation where essentially what's happening in a nutshell is that participants are going through a series of meetings that are cross-functional and cross-organizational. There's two organizations. And mind you, there's one organization that's larger and it has more financial resources. And then there's a smaller organization that's more nimble, but it has the technology. And what participants begin to find out during their meetings is that they really have a choice about what they're going to do with competitor threats on the outside. Are they going to collaborate and partner together to be better at what they do? Or are they going to begin to compete against each other? So what you'll notice here is these series of meetings that people are going through, and they're really going to be strategizing about what direction they want to take the group in. And the interesting thing about edge work is that you really get to understand, particularly for an intact team or inside one particular culture, what is it that they're oriented to, right? What is it that they're really attempting to do, and how do those corporate values show up in the work through edge work? Now, EdgeWork has a fantastic debriefing, and this is just an example of one of the types of debriefs that they go through, and this is what we call a boundary map. And so the fun thing about this is clients will sometimes not look overly excited that they're having to draw pictures of their experiences, but it can create such a powerful debrief. And the only thing that we give to them is, here are some symbols that you can use. You can talk about teams and divisions. You can talk about business opportunities. You can talk about uncertainties and conflicts and constraints. And as you might be able to see, it's not perfectly clear on this picture. There's a big lightning bolt that's going down the middle of this particular presentation because this team felt a huge amount of conflict. And so the spirit of the language that they're sharing about their experience is reflected so deeply about those pictures, and it's really an interesting way to get people to do it. And as you see in all of these, this is the same client organization. Each one of these groups had a very different experience from each other. And that's part of the learning that happens that you wouldn't necessarily happen without having that debriefing. Now, there's some additional pieces that they're going to go through. So there's a fishbowl debrief after that, where the participants are kind of exploring and sharing their perspectives of the experience. Then the facilitator piece that's looking at themes that came up and decision-making and team effectiveness and organizational culture. And then on top of that can be layered things that you've negotiated with your clients. So if they have something that they want to integrate in terms of a workplace assessment, or if they've got something that they've done corporately in terms of an initiative like collaboration, all of those can be integrated into the discussion. And what's unique about doing something like this is that edge work could invite a lot of competition. And so then it becomes a much richer conversation around the complexity of collaborating when there is competitive forces out there. Press time is our kind of most thoughtful simulation. It is kind of the Cadillac of all simulations that MHS has. It's web-based. It's very challenging. It's at least a day and a half. And it's a pretty intense day. And there's never a perfect win. So as these clients are interacting with the simulation, there are many client groups that will never go to market. They may post a financial loss. They sometimes have dynamics that happen within the teams. And all of this is part of the learning as it unfolds at the very end. And the next day, the participants come back and do peer feedback. And so the facilitator is going to walk them through a debriefing on what their specific group experienced. And then they're going to get a chance to give feedback to each other in terms of what they observed, and where they felt people contributed, and where they may felt that the participants might have derailed their productivity. And so this is hands down one of the most powerful experiences participants can go through that I've been part of. And I've had clients that make references to the learning even a year out from the experience in manager alignment calls. So it can be a very effective way to encourage leader development. Now, the last one, and this is a picture, I just wanted to share this very briefly. And this is to demonstrate how you can find the most unanticipated things that happen in the middle of a simulation. You'll notice on the left two slides, the group is circled up. So essentially the HR manager stopped the simulation in the middle of the day and said, I don't like the way that the team is working together, and we're going to do a team building exercise right now. Now, this is not built into the simulation at all. And so this is kind of the uniqueness that can come out of groups sometimes. You're kind of looking at where the collective spirit takes them and how they respond to challenges. And it can be quite interesting to see how groups respond to these things. Now, the last one that I want to talk to you today about is paper scrapers. And paper scrapers is a fun, real quick and dirty kind of exercise. And it's a great way to talk about change, for example. Right? It's a fun exercise in itself as a standalone. But if you were to integrate the change DAW indicator as an example, I'll share a little bit about how it happens. So each of these groups are given a kit, and they're given the instructions that they're going to build a paper scraper or a skyscraper made out of paper, and they have to use just the tools that are inside the kit. And they're given a certain amount of time, and they're given instructions on how they make a presentation. So this is all over the place in terms of what those skyscrapers look like when they're done. And what's interesting about this, if they've done a change style facilitation where we've talked about their approach or their preference for change, we're going to take the participants that are the most conservative, those that are most likely to be change resistant or most likely to make small changes in their lives, and pair them together. And then we're going to take the pragmatists, those people that are kind of situationally open to change, but kind of are looking for what the context calls for. And then we're going to take the originators, those people that are pushing the envelope, highly innovative, love to work in building new ways of doing things. And we're going to break them up into like-minded groups. And we're going to ask them to build these paper scrapers. And when you get to the presentations, right, you've got a much deeper way of helping people understand what those change orientations can look like. Because when you have these conservator groups that build these paper scrapers that are very sturdy and that are very traditional, and their presentations are very traditional, you begin to understand what their change orientation looks like. And as you go more towards the originator perspective, you're going to see really the groups that make songs and dances and are engaged in kind of very innovative activities. And again, we can reinforce what their individual preferences look like that showed up on paper that we've talked about in a traditional training session, and say, this is how it looks in the real world. So obviously, we're there to build esprit de corps with teams. This is the relational piece. And this is part of that learning journey that happens so quickly, right? We're giving them the learning horizon very, very fast to build those relationships. Each group, the way that they interact with these simulations is going to be different. And therefore, as a facilitator, you may see patterns across groups, but you're going to also begin to feel the uniqueness between groups as well. So the last piece that I want to focus on before we get to Q&A is really around powerful debriefs. And this is essentially the most important part of the day, because they've had fun, they've learned a lot, and we need to help them understand what that is, right? We need to take the time to work with a client group and walk them through that journey, and have them reflect on what the true meaning of that experience was, and then also to reflect how it relates to work and what, if anything, they can do from those experiences. All right, so the debriefs, and let me just go through this pretty quickly. We can integrate the team results. So a lot of our simulations have data to them. So that creates metrics that we all live by, that are going to create kind of more of that psychological fidelity and more relevance to them as it relates to work. There's both intergroup discussions. So if you're running multiple cohorts at once, then there's comparisons across teams, how the performance was. There's intra-group discussions. So during the debriefings, they're talking amongst just themselves privately about how their session went. These are highly customizable, so you can bring in customer variables that your clients value, their core values, into your simulations. And then there's a big wrap up. So when we talk about the customized facilitations, you can bring in kind of assessments into them. You can also bring in any kind of corporate themes into them. So this is where they're very open frame. So I've already kind of touched on some of these things. Open framed, lots of data, high touch, high tech, and you can use as little time as you want or as much time as the client will allow to create these great development experiences. And here's a couple of things that as a facilitator you can be looking at to better understand kind of what is it that is observable, what came up in the group, and what should I even be looking at for the debriefings? There might be organizational cultural variables that come up. So this is how resistant are they to change? How quick are they to making decisions? Do they tend to be very independent or do they tend to be very interdependent? Are they overly concerned about cost? Are they not concerned at all about cost? Are they not concerned about performance outcomes? How did the group behave together? What types of relationships did they have, right? We can talk about change preferences or any other type of individual difference. We can talk about emotional intelligence. How does it interact with the job knowledge that they need to do the work back home? And then also, uniquely, what kind of operating assumptions did the group use as they were interacting with the simulations? So here's a couple of commonly questions that come up. And yes, every once in a while, you do have to manage people that are skeptical, people that are negative emotions that come up, and in a variety of engagement levels. And that's just like work is, right? We know that this is kind of part of the real life. And that's why facilitated debriefings are so important. The boss may need to be prepped for the experience, and the boss may need to be prepped for the debriefings as well. And then bad behaviors do happen. And I find in my experience that sometimes those bad behaviors encourage the team to double down and learn more. So if you can absolve a little bit of perfectionism and invite the group experience, it can be really a really deep learning experience. You have to manage time and short deadlines and provide space for everybody to learn. So calling on people who haven't contributed and letting the introverts do their portion as well. And then last but not least, the more that you let the group carry the situation, the more value they're going to get out of it. Along with our traditional methods of debriefing, there's so many ways to integrate other values into it, like having participants chart their energy and interest levels, to do it based on what we call graffiti walls, where they're using symbols to describe that, relationship maps that I covered earlier in the EdgeWork simulation, using leadership metaphors or the image insights. And let me go a little bit deeper on that. So the insights are a card deck that can be used with any type of question. Questions like, what does it look like when you're at your best? And what does it look like at your worst? And so at your best, you might be picking the card that's got a group bicycling together in a race because they're in lockstep and things are going so well. And at your worst, right, you might pick that burning house to reflect what it feels like when there are poor financial results. And that can be a great way to integrate kind of a deeper level into those debriefings. Simulations can be used, obviously, in leadership development, as we've talked about today, team development during change management projects, mergers and acquisitions, for example. They work very well for conflict interventions, for innovation and creativity, for new managers, for high potentials, for working and influencing in a matrixed organization. There's a variety of different reasons to use them. all facilitators know that it's really important to create a safe learning space. And so we're intentional about making sure that at the very beginning, we've set those good ground rules so that people feel like they have the space to learn and behave and try new things, and to do it without being criticized. And then as a facilitator, we have to be open to a couple of things. We have to be open to making sure that we're integrating takeaways for people to take back to the office. We need to make sure that even if we do have metrics in our simulations, that we're reframing that winning, right? It's about learning. It's about the experience with the team. It's about the relationships you build, and it's great if you win as well. But there's other things that are just as important. And so as we keep this in mind, the facilitations are so much deeper and richer. So we've helped people go through this, and we've remained a positive force so that everybody is able to get the maximum value out of our leadership experiences together. And this is the type of feedback that I tend to get at the very end. Thank goodness we finally did something useful, right? I'm getting worn out by activities, and this is something that I can actually relate to. Or I felt stuck about the situation we're going through, and this was really helpful. And this is very commonplace type of feedback that you'll get as a facilitator of these types of simulations. Now, lastly, I want to leave you with this notion that from our perspective, the experience does define the learning. What you create as a facilitator is going to ultimately be what the client leverages. And this quote by Socrates seems to sum it up for us so well. Nothing is so well learned as that which is discovered. And that's what we're here for. So with that in mind, I want to thank you so much for being with us today. I want to encourage you to either connect with me about any questions or concerns you have about the simulations, or with the OD Solutions Group or MHS customer service, because we'd love to encourage you to be part of these simulations. Now, I think we have a couple of minutes for questions. So Selena, do we have any questions from the group today?
Hi, Sam. Yes, we have quite a few. The first one is, what if you have a resistant leader that is a sponsor for your simulation? And how do you create buy-in, and what are some watchouts?
Yeah, so I think I'd be curious to know more about what that resistance was. I think that, as part of getting grounded in these simulations, it's really about learning about what the outcomes look like. What do clients who've been through these simulations tend to walk away from that experience with? And that's where we have to orient our clients to. Why are we doing this work together? Why are we taking important time out of people's work and productivity? And how could this help them do their jobs better? And so I think that working with a client to better understand the outcomes is a great way to deal with resistance.
Okay. The next question is, so the simulation was a success and everyone is jazzed. How do we make sure to get traction when we go back to our day jobs?
That is a great question. So let me tell you what I did last week with a group of clients who were doing paper planes. So at the very end, it was myself and another colleague who were facilitating two different groups. These groups were consecutively going through their own paper planes experience. They did 3 runs, 3 debriefs, two redesigns, and we get to the end of the day and we bring all of them back together. They reveal their results to each other, right? I wasn't bragging. My team did a little bit better, but it's okay. And what we did in order to help them really make the integrations is we took different table topics and we said, so what is customer service? What is innovation? What does change look like? And we picked different topics like that, and we had them do small group discussions. How does this relate, what you experience today, to what you do at work? And so we had them process that and flip chart their ideas. They reported it out to the large group. And then we asked them to take the 2 to 3 best ideas and to create some goals around it. And so they did that independently. And then as a homework from that, they had to be in touch with their internal coaches and let them know specifically, as a result of having participated in paper planes, what they were going to take back to the workplace and what they were planning to commit to doing. So that's one way to create an integration.
Okay, awesome. Next question is there an ideal mix of conservators, originators, pragmatists? Which ones get along best or worse?
That's the kind of question sometimes that clients will ask, for sure. So I'm going to tell you two responses. The one response is, if you have a large enough group of anything, there's going to be distributions, right? You're going to have most of the people kind of in the middle and a quarter on each side, right? That's what a standard distribution looks like. But 60 something people in the middle, and then the remaining part on each side. The reality is, with some client groups, it doesn't always look that way. So you could have 150 sales managers from all of North America for a client, and they're all originators except for 10 of them. And I've had this experience before. And the reality is, there's no good or bad. There's just a reality. And we have to talk to our clients about, what is the impact of having the distribution that your group has? Where does it position you to be particularly good at? And what are you going to have a blind spot around? And so there can be great discussions. It's actually a little bit more fun when you have skewed groups like that.
Okay, great.
Anything else?
We have a comment as well that said great information. And their question is, can you share best practices from switching from facilitator and role within simulation?
Well, you have to be transparent about what you're doing with your clients and let them know ahead of time, right? So if you're going to be both a facilitator and you're going to be a client, then you want to orient them to what that looks like and what that's going to be. Because if you are, for example, going to be a client and you're asking pointed questions about performance and outcomes, and they see you as a facilitator, they may not quite understand where you're coming from, and that's probably not going to turn out real well. So you want to be clear about what those roles are and what you're intending to do, and people usually tend to be pretty flexible about that.
Okay. We have time for one last question. If learning by doing is the most powerful way to train and develop adults, why don't more organizations use experiential learning?
That's a $1 million question right there, because I think that it may be that they've just not ever been experienced in or exposed to experiential learning practices. Sometimes when we do certifications with practitioners, we'll help them brainstorm on ways to create some assessments and to make them more experiential, right? You might have small group work, or you might have peer coaching, or you might have some kind of facilitated activity about highest and lowest on any kind of type of domain or preference. And that's beginning to help interact more with that content. And this is completely different. This is actually asking them to have a smaller experience within the experience that facilitates a deeper learning curve. And it's a conundrum. I don't know why more organizations don't invest in this, but I'd recommend it if you've heard this and you feel like you want to be the pioneer in an organization. I will salute that. I think that's a great idea.
Okay, thank you so much, Sam. I think that's it for today. I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. A special thank you to our presenter, Sam Turner, for sharing insights on advanced leadership development using simulations. Be sure to check out the recording on MHS Talent YouTube. Thank you again, and have a great day.